having some technical issues. Let's go to you, Michele. Michele, I know you've worked a lot on the rights of undocumented migrants, and I think it's important to also shed light on what the absence of documentation does to migrants. And I think at the beginning of the webinar, we started by asking, is documentation important? And I want to see what's your take on this? Is documentation important, and the lack of documentation, what kind of impact does it have on migrants?
Thanks a lot, Rula. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hopefully seeing as well. So thanks very much for organizing this. It's very impressive actually to be going through all the 23 objectives of the Global Compact on Migration with a webinar. So I wanted to shed some light on the experiences of our network in looking at two parts of Objective 4, which are basically the last two parts, the F and the G section, which basically look at kind of an answer also to your question, Rula. What happens when you don't have documentation? And as Pia already said, you want to access services or you want to access justice. And just give some examples from the region of Europe where PICUM is based. I wanted to start off with talking a little bit about what we've seen as developments during the COVID-19 pandemic, because they've actually, I think, been interesting in terms of accessing services. So we've seen a couple of different types of responses when you consider both the national level, the city level, and the regional level. First, on the national level, we've seen two countries in the past 6 months that have granted some form of regularization so that people who were undocumented could access services safely, or if it wasn't a regularization, it was a type of firewall. And so these two examples were Portugal. I think many of you most likely followed the example of Portugal, where it was a country that developed a temporary regularization for people who had applied for a residence permit early in the year. And the benefit of the regularization procedure was that those people who had applied and who were granted this measure in lockdown could get access to social protection easily. So without, even though they were undocumented, even though their application was pending, they had this temporary regularization. So it was estimated that around 20,000 to 30,000 people would have been reached by this. However, 80,000 to 100,000 were most likely also excluded. And that was because this was a regularization that concerned people who had already applied. So, and those people who didn't apply never had the chance to apply because they didn't have all the required proof that they were workers or other things that were needed at the time. So the other national level example that we found was Ireland. Ireland is interesting because it's precisely what we're looking at in this video. So it was a firewall measure. So Ireland decided that during the pandemic, during the lockdown, undocumented migrants would have full access to social welfare and healthcare. And authorities confirmed that there would be no data sharing between service providers and immigration officers. Undocumented workers who lost their job because of the COVID effects on the economy could also apply for the pandemic unemployment payment, which was a payment of 350 euros per week for a period of 12 weeks. That's extremely interesting because we have not found any other examples in Europe of a national level government enabling undocumented workers to be eligible for unemployment due to the pandemic. So most of the European countries were offering some support to unemployed workers, but that did not include undocumented, whereas in Ireland it did. And then another example is on the national level, access to food and nutrition schemes and shelters during the pandemic. So we saw that in 7 countries, Belgium, Finland, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Spain, and Switzerland, undocumented migrants could get access to food and nutrition schemes. And in 8 countries, they could get access to emergency shelter. Belgium, the Czech Republic, Finland, Malta, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. So this is kind of what we've seen as examples on the national level. If we look at the other levels of government, this is also where it's interesting. The city level in Italy, the central government had made available 400 million euros via the Civil Protection Department for cities across Italy to issue supermarket vouchers to local residents. But then each city or municipality had to decide the criteria to access it. And in Rome, a judicial decision, and this is also in relevance to what Pia had just ended with about working with judges and lawyers on undocumented and their human rights, and making sure that the jurisprudence also reflects this. So thanks to a judicial decision, the purpose of that benefit that the national level government had made, the judge decided that it would be illegitimate for the city to set conditions such as making sure that they had a registered address, which would limit the number of beneficiaries, and that wasn't requested by law. So thanks to this judicial decision, undocumented migrants in the city of Rome could be eligible to receive those supermarket vouchers. We found a couple other examples of the city level in the Netherlands. I had already mentioned the national level about night shelters, but also the city of Amsterdam provided space for homeless people until the 1st of August, including undocumented. The Hague also had some temporary shelters until early July. And also the city of Amsterdam was giving some financial support to NGOs to help strengthen their own support to undocumented. And so also just briefly, we also saw some regional level responses. So regional here, we mean sub-level of government. So in Spain, they have various autonomous regions. And in early April, the government of the region of the Balearic Islands passed an expansion of its guaranteed social income to cover all adults who were experiencing a social emergency due to COVID. That actually was also then granted to undocumented. The regional government allowed 6 NGOs to receive direct subsidies so that they could pay undocumented migrants that support who didn't have a bank account. In Switzerland, the city of Geneva also passed a law to offer financial compensation for up to 80% of the income lost during the period from March until May. This would also extend to undocumented, and the city of and the canton of Zurich were also, like the other examples, giving funds to NGOs to help undocumented meet their basic needs. So all of these are really interesting examples because they're the most recent, and they also, we think, are somewhat exceptional. Because across this region, undocumented were essential workers, like in many other regions, and yet we're not guaranteed any of, and the majority were not guaranteed the support that everyone else needed during COVID times. So I wanted to finish then with looking at the other 2 areas and how we see them. So access to healthcare and access to justice. We see in terms of access to healthcare that undocumented in general in this region in Europe have very limited entitlements to healthcare under national law. And as Pia had already said, even if they might have the entitlements, they just by going to benefit from it, they would risk being reported if there's no firewall. The same is true for access to justice. In this region and in many other regions as well, law enforcement officials see undocumented victims as offenders, so not as victims. So basically, it's almost impossible to try to report a crime if you're undocumented because the police will report you to the immigration authorities. If that means if you're a woman who's experienced gender-based violence, there have been many, many cases of women who are undocumented reporting the crime of their undocumented partner. And there has been cases also of the two being put in a police cell and being deported together, the woman who was the victim and her aggressor. So we have cases like that that I'm sure you also see in your regions. But access to justice is even much more problematic than access to healthcare because of this whole incidents about reporting personal identities from the police to the immigration authorities. What we find is interesting is in this area, this is where the EU itself has legislation. There's the Victims of Crime Directive from many years ago, from a number of years ago, but it's not that old. And what's interesting is the Victims of Crime Directive in the first article says that the scope of the whole directive is applicable to all victims of crime, regardless of residence status. So that was a huge opening of a door to mean that undocumented migrants could potentially benefit from the protections in this legislation. And in June of this year, the European Commission launched its first strategy on victims' rights. So bearing in mind the legislation, how would the EU now go about developing a whole strategy? And in this strategy, they explicitly recognize how being undocumented makes a person more vulnerable to victimization. And the EU in the next 5 years, which is how long these strategies are going to last, it wants to look at exchanging good practices. So also what Pia had just ended on, kind of how can we share some of the good practices. So I'd just like to conclude, I have some figures, I can give you those later, but I think the figures, they all speak for themselves in different regions. But basically just to conclude, that it has been interesting to look at what the pandemic has shared with us as lessons. That we all know that if you don't treat everyone in the pandemic, you're not going to make any progress. You have to, public health knows no boundaries or passports or frontiers, so you have to treat everyone to have some kind of an impact. And we also saw that there were a number of practices in Europe, besides the ones that I've mentioned. There were also states that released people from detention, temporary suspensions of return, etc. But basically, we have 5 points that we wanted to make sure that going forward, we transform anything that's seen as emergency measures into more long-lasting kind of policies. And the first one is that to ensure that minimum income and other social protection schemes would apply to everyone in need without regard to migration status. The second one is on healthcare, to ensure that everyone can access the full complement of health services, so preventative and curative care, and that firewalls could be put in place so that they can practically also enjoy them. The third one would be that civil society organizations that are critical to connecting to marginalized communities could be empowered by having access to information, delivery services, and social support so that they can also reach these communities. The fourth one is that individuals who are undocumented could be prevented by having further irregularity by renewing, extending, or issuing residence permits. And there's actually a number of good examples to look at. And the last one is to end immigration detention and to favor alternatives to detention. So I'll stop it here because I know we don't want to take too much time in the beginning, but would be happy to draw upon anything in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. You know, some very interesting examples also from the European context. And I was wondering, I'll just follow up with you with a question, because I was wondering, you know, with the few advocacy points you shared towards the end, I do see that they are a mix of, one, working on the issue of, you know, access to services and firewalls, which is, you know, one part of it, but also on regularization. I was wondering if you see these as going together in the sense of preventing people becoming undocumented, facilitating documentation, but also working on the advocacy of what happens when people become undocumented. Do you think this is this because you think this is inevitable one way or another? We will still have people who are undocumented, or because they go together? What's your take on this?
Yeah, thanks, Rula. I think it's a great question. When we did this report on labor exploitation, looking at good practices of NGOs and trade unions in Europe and the United States many years ago, we called it 10 Ways to Protect Undocumented Workers. The 9 ways were basically, how do you help a worker who's undocumented once they have been exploited? So what can you practically do? And there were 9 ways that we found. I mean, we just highlighted 9, there are many other ones, but those were just kind of exploratory. And the 10th way was regularization. So basically we felt you have to always do both because in a sense, the undocumented population can, in a sense, be given status through regularization, but not everyone always benefits from regularization. So there are always, even with regularization schemes or ongoing programs in the law, there's always people who don't benefit from that. And also the way that governments are developing the regular pathways doesn't meet the demand. So even if they introduce more regular pathways, it's still not fulfilling the entire demand. Tomorrow, the European Union will launch the new Migration Pact. So this is the whole strategy for the EU on migration in the next 5 years. We are most likely not going to see any new regular pathways, but we have various sectors of the economy in the EU where undocumented workers are quite present. So we know that that will continue to be a reality. And so that's why it's really important, we find, to always work in both, to see it as a whole kind of picture and never just as one or the other.
Thanks a lot, Michele. I think these are very important points from your intervention. And you know, it's funny that you talk about regular pathways. I will try